The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. Number 1. A General Introduction to My Interests and Times. Tuesday morning, January 25, 1977. This book will consist of a series of lectures held in the theater of the imaginative mind, for it is in that larger dimension of experience in which I now have my being. No more will I address my colleagues in the hallowed academic halls, for there I will have lost the credentials that once brought me such respect, since the very conditions of my existence now would make me an outcast from such conventional gatherings. In the world in which once I so gladly took my place, the dead have few rights, for their existence goes unrecognized, and no psychologies prepare them for the transitions that occur as the soul moves into realms for which no earthly education can prepare it. Being of melancholy mind, I anticipated my own death so often, however, and built such dire forebodings of dissolution and decay, that the fact of death came as an intellectual and emotional revelation of unspeakable degree, whose brightness dimmed all other events of my life, so that by contrast my death became the crowning achievement of my life. This need not have been the case, however, for had I understood and followed the natural contours of the mind, then I would have allowed the unconventional aspects of my heart and mind alike greater freedom, and I would have perceived amid the tumultuous details of my life those other vaster shapes of emotion and natural force upon which our earthly existences unerringly ride. My world was a lively one that saw the birth of psychology, not realizing that it was swaddled in the placenta of old religious beliefs and still immersed in ancient prejudices. Mine was the time of techniques, when academicians and scientists and world leaders were all convinced that certain techniques of government or psychology or religion could bring about an age of enduring prosperity, peace, and contentment, and subdue the natural world, which included men's natural inclinations and physical environment. A spirit of high but false optimism often prevailed, as one by one new techniques were applied and failed, so that in my own private life I teetered between the loftiest sentiments of hope and faith and the darkest depths of disillusionment and despair. Melancholy robbed my peace of mind. When I addressed colleagues or students on the larger aspects of the mind or soul, I constantly questioned my own speeches and criticized the results of my investigations. And when I spoke most resoundingly about the opportunities of democracy, I wondered most about the qualities of the individual upon which any democracy must basically rest. I was at once overly credulous and overly critical, so that my emotions and intellect rarely met as friends on any common ground, but rather as adversaries geared for battle, each prepared with its own arguments and defense. My melancholy then denied me of even an animal's content with its days, so that I grew querulous even to myself. Yet equally I sensed in myself and in others the highest potentials of enjoyment and achievement, and wondered what invisible psychological veil separated us from at least a partial realization of our fondest hopes. Freed by death from the conventional frameworks of thought and belief that surrounded me, I have gained in death insights and comprehensions of the greatest consequence. Ironically, I wonder why these did not come to me in physical life, where certainly I could have put them to as good a use, particularly when it is obvious that they were as available in life as in death. And I am convinced that only certain beliefs and attitudes of mind made these insights psychologically invisible. Those beliefs and attitudes of mind come equally from psychology and religion, which meet like a bride and groom at a shotgun wedding, unwillingly, and bringing to birth an offspring of which each parent is secretly ashamed. The groom, psychology, accepts the importance of emotions only so that they can be intellectually categorized and laid away in lifeless compartments, isolated from the faculties of the reasoning mind. Religion, on the other hand, steadfastly offers gifts of hope and intuition, exaltation and creativity, while nervously shying away from any critical examination that might reveal flaws in emotional diamonds that are displayed, never used, but packed away like ancient wedding gifts. These are perhaps unjust comments, but as one who dabbled in psychology and religion both, and attempted to form from each one unified philosophy, I feel in some regard responsible for those insights I might have added to such issues, yet did not. I find myself determined to lend what light I can upon such matters, particularly since my experience of time is now so luxurious as to provide unlimited access to thought's processes, unhampered by appointments or life's necessities. At the same time, I am also hesitant, realizing that perhaps the dead should not have any rights in the world of the living, since the dead have had their time of action in that regard. The limelight was once theirs, and only a greedy actor and an exceedingly egotistical one returns to play a scene when his part has been cut out. Nor can I, as myself, directly intrude, for that precise focusing of intent, mind, and vision is no longer mine, and the psychic components of my personality now form a different cast, reflecting other experiences that by themselves preclude any tampering of note with your own world. So, instead, like an aged, experienced actor, no longer taking part in tragedies, farces, or morality plays, but possessing still a nostalgic love of life's stage, I speak lines from the vast theater in which life's plays have their setting, and point out what I have learned of life's props and plots. Even so, I must take unconventional ways that allow me to speak between the lines, to utter my words between sentences spoken by others, to make my gestures between those official ones that are written into the script of the players' lives. I must, therefore, cast my thoughts through the mind of another, one now acting, flush in the middle of life, one willing to listen to promptings that seem to come from strange sources. Strange sources indeed! I myself in life studied and probed the odd, unofficial elements of the mind or soul, trying to tread a careful line between the tenets of science and religion, and seeking out the distant corners hidden within the dogmas of each. I sought out the scientific laboratories and the seance rooms, the learned and the ignorant, the humble and the proud, in an effort to track down strange sources from which scientific inventions or religious conversions could alike emerge. In almost all cases, either intellect or emotions were outraged. What emotionally elated me brought only intellectual embarrassment, not just from colleagues but from the judgments of my own overly wearied mind, and those theories that sent my intellect reeling with delight and excitement left my emotions afterwards dry and unwarmed, as if that intellectual fire burned with a flame that was cold and white, blinding, but not life-giving. I find myself, in that respect at least, more lively in death than I was before, somewhat a pity, for that bone-dry life of mine could have used such healthy, natural, kindling firewood as I have only lately discovered. I hope, then, that the insights I have to impart will add to the emotional richness of my readers' days, so that life is left in all its natural warmth. A life in a castle of a soul is no blessing if that castle is dark, cold, damp, or filled with the musty beliefs of ancient histories, while a cottage of a soul, cosily lit, can be most pleasant and provide the self with a kindly roadside inn that makes even long journeys enjoyable and venturesome. So I have turned from being an investigator of strange sources into a perfect instance of the kind of phenomenon that in life I would have tracked down, filled with hopes and skepticisms and carrying my own bag of beliefs invisibly with me, as much a part of my psychological attire as my trousers and waistcoat were of my exterior wear. For in life you are always surrounded by a comedy of manners, social conventions that are sometimes easy to espy, though more difficult to break, and in an interior set of psychological manners or psychic niceties that go unrecognized. In so intruding upon your world and adopting such an unacademic method of expression, I am therefore dismissing as beneath my notice some very important psychological conventions. Children should be seen and not heard. The dead, it seems, are expected to remain unseen and unheard, polite enough not to intrude in the conversations of the living, who will only pretend not to hear, or at best try to find another, more logical explanation. In this regard, I can be accused of having poor spiritual manners. There are, on the other hand, those who will only too gladly hear any voice as a messenger from the dead, who will assign to the most innocent knocking of door or wall evidence of the power of the dead's forces, and who possesses in their way a dogma and set of conventions as rigid as those of any hard-headed scientist. Yet the tendencies and characteristics of those seemingly opposite groups represent the unresolved fractions of the human soul caught between faith and doubt, logic and intuition, and poised between the alternating dogmas of daily life and dreams. Certainly it seemed to me in life that in the morning's dawn and in the midnight were parted by a design that also echoed the mind and heart of man, in which the intuitions and the intellect reigned separated from each other, each ruling different worlds that dominated opposing fractions of the soul. Everywhere I was surrounded by the rousing daytime routs of industry, the galloping growth of governmental power with its shining emblems, the waking of archaeology with its blustering exploration of the sleeping past. The great virile energy of the people swelled in energetic bursts of objective doing, and a brassy optimism swept before it, so that it seemed that each secret of nature and of the human heart would soon lie bare. For my last years were the last of the nation's innocence, before exuberance turned frantic, when it seemed that any problem could be solved if only the proper gusto were applied, the right techniques in the approved American style. Yet that period was already darkened with psychological shadows that spread from Europe's past, and that age gave us both Freud and Myers. F. W. H. Myers was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in London in 1882. He was the author of Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, which became a classic in the field, and his work was known to William James. The country followed Freud and found the inner portions of the soul distasteful, containing relics of unbridled lusts and passions, primitive tribal impulses that would, if not ripped out by the roots, destroy the objective structure of the world. And those forces seemed passive, stubborn, feminine, and unconquerable. At best they could be evacuated, thrown out into the cheerful work-day air, poked fun at, so that the reek of nature could dissipate in the new smoke that rose from the thousands of factories born from technology's gusty triumph. Wednesday morning, January 26, 1977. Yet what a rambunctious nationalistic romp, and it was matched with almost missionary fever by the psychologists, out to rout from man's soul all of those inconsistencies and passions that were buried there, and to leash these as well for the splendid pursuits of progress, industry, and the physical manipulation of nature for man's use. So, energetically, we set out to probe the mind, the will, determined to mine all of our resources, and some of us, myself included, found hidden within man's more mundane abilities hints of powers that more than equaled technology's promise. We discovered the existence of clairvoyance, precognition, telepathy, like finer precious metals lying half obscured by the ordinary, grosser thinking process of men's minds. More, we sensed within the commonest of men and women a sleeping motive energy that could at any time suddenly awaken, transforming the individual's life and bringing to the forefront abilities, faculties, and energies not there before. Safely, from the respectable social and intellectual framework of my occupation, I dabbled rather seriously in these matters, using my intellect like a sturdy carpet to hold my feet above the mud, for those precious gems of abilities were often found in muddy mental ground indeed. And I began to sift and weigh those instances of seeming supernormal abilities that I found. A messy business often enough, yet one in which there was always the possibility of discovering a talent of great merit, a report that checked out with scientific accuracy, a dream that came to life with such similarity to the original that its precognitive nature must be accepted as scientific fact. We joined learned societies, left our academic halls, fully clothed, however, in our professional attire, canes or umbrellas tapping smartly upon the walks, hats correctly tilted, gloves properly cuffed, and any afternoon or evening might find us strolling grandly into a medium's lacy parlor, where the sobs of a newly bereaved droned out the cheerful business-like twittering of sparrows in the busy air outside. "Nearer, my God, to thee," was a favorite of the many hymns played, usually on a poorly tuned piano or sung by a sad-eyed soprano, as the bereaved were told to concentrate their thoughts upon the beloved, recently dead, presumably absent member of the family, because that member might in truth be present, though in a different form, aware, though with another kind of perception, and it was the medium's job to serve as the spark connecting the coiled realities of the living and the dead. A sorry task at times, yet if the mind of man could transform the face of the country, harness physical energies of which we'd only dreamed before, might it not survive death after all? Perhaps the scientists, innocent of religion's darker superstitions, could discern the truth and discover even in the shoddiest of seances that one indisputable proof that would release man from his ancient fear of death and annihilation. If the mediums strenuously objected to lights, insisting that their conditions necessitated darkness, they could not, we reasoned, shut out the light of the intellectual, scientifically tuned mind, and that illumination we were determined to use unremittingly. At the time, I considered myself something of a bold explorer, often risking the dirtied psychological environment of the ignorant and unlettered, the superstitious and the unprincipled, treading unhealthy psychological waters when necessary, in order to conquer the inner continents of the mind as surely as men in other fields and persuasions had conquered the land. Wednesday afternoon, January 26, 1977. We took notes of any proceedings, however ludicrous, that seemed to offer promise. We investigated, interviewed, and tested, and often we were scoffed at, gently and behind our backs, by our colleagues, and sometimes openly by the mediums themselves. Yet on our parts, I insist, there was an integrity of intent, and if we were bookish, easily fooled on occasion, even blinded by our own lofty principles or taken advantage of because of them, still we were not entirely lured by the more shallow aspects of democracy and technology, but determined to bring these to deeper, more mature fruition by examining the mind or soul that gave them birth. The power of the mind, the subliminal self, these phrases stirred us to the depths, for as doers we were positive that a democracy could truly develop the individual, raise his abilities to the nth degree, and harness them for the good of God, man, and society. Though seeking to map the dimensions of the soul, we sought to align ourselves professionally with the intellect, with an enlightened Protestantism and virile optimism that could, we felt, best protect us from the mire of emotionalism, fantasism, and sheer idiocy that sometimes surrounded the matter at hand. While giving lip service to such sentiments, however, I myself suffered the darkest melancholy for much of my life, and I was particularly struck by the fact that religious conversions, for example, while releasing power and energy in individual men, could exaggerate some of their less favorable characteristics also, deepen their prejudices, and increase a paranoia that earlier had been only latent. To add to my concern, there seemed no scientific proof for survival of the dead. Even indisputable instances of apparitions of the departed could be explained in other ways, as perceptive errors, hallucinations, or even as interpretations of telepathic data, then reconstructed imaginatively by the perceiver. I felt most strongly that an investigation and exploration of the soul of a man must parallel his mechanistic development, however, and was convinced that such studies must take place under the respected banners of science and the academic community. We sought out particularly the reports of staunch citizens, therefore, people innocent of duplicity, known in their communities, and we quickly discovered that precognition and telepathy, those unconventional quirks of mind, were experienced even by citizens who were otherwise unimaginative, devoted to their work and families, and in no way different from their fellows. Yet the data depended often upon conversations of the past, or scribbled notes written on the back of envelopes, and the very nature of the dream state meant, of course, that few witnesses were present when and if a startled dreamer awakened to blurt out a clairvoyant dream vivid enough to jar him from sleep. With all of this, however, our evidence was enough to convince me that such unofficial elements of the mind existed, and that they ignored known laws of science. It was impossible then not to muse about the future existence of a technology of mind, more splendid than industry or science's mechanical triumphs, a technology able to utilize perhaps stronger energies than those available otherwise. And it was unthinkable, at least to me, that the powers of the mind could really contradict the laws of science. They would simply point out new directions for science to follow and help it avoid limitations caused by its own beliefs. The experiments of the laboratory are predictable, but, alas, the mind is the least predictable phenomenon in the world. The emotions, sweeping across the mind's broad expanse, often seemed to distort reliable data, and it seemed to me that my own emotions gave me more trouble than feelings give most men. For one thing, I was afraid lest my emotions contaminate my investigations, realizing that mediums were sometimes good psychologists, quite willing to assign to spirits the insights gained from the practiced, shrewd use of common sense. So I resolved not to wear my feelings upon my sleeve, to guard my utterances, even my facial expressions in such instances, and my bodily stance as well. And that reticence on my part was instantly interpreted by some of the mediums as a pompous bag of secrecy to be poked, probed, and prodded with exuberant glee. Thursday morning, January 27, 1977. I was modest and secretive in many ways. I strove to be mannerly without overdoing protocol, and adventuresome without accusing others of undue timidity. With my colleagues and in the academic halls, I could allow my creativity reign. That is, I dared to speak about issues like mysticism and cosmic consciousness. I gave some stirring speeches that aroused in my listeners those aspiring emotions of faith and hope, and speaking, I felt faith and hope. Yet I allowed myself such emotional luxury only because I was surrounded by an emotional economy and dryness that would automatically temper my enthusiasm. And always, speaking, my demeanor was reasonable, in that those feelings were not allowed to affect my actions in such a way as to cause embarrassment. My pronunciation was so correct, for example, that its very preciseness served to rein in any permissiveness that emotionally tinged words might otherwise, and quite normally, suggest. Professionally, I was regarded as an avant-garde in my fashion because I did give voice to subjects avoided by others, and because I tried in however cautious a manner to introduce questions of the soul to scientific speculation. In the séance room, my natural modesty was offended by the exuberant, sometimes rambunctious creativity I found there, the almost tawdry overindulgence in energetic power. At the same time, I was often in awe, as one is when faced with the sheer vitality displayed by the very young, undisciplined, unadult, unreasonable by usual standards, but hinting at such raw power that the adult wonders at the forgotten energy of his own youth. It's quite possible that my own disciplined manner elicited such response on the part of mediums in particular, for I had a reputation of scientific objectivity to uphold. No sleight of hand or emotional ploy could be allowed to dull my wits. No religious setting or sentimental tears of piety make me forget the sometimes sly duplicity with which some of the most sincere-seeming mediums could deceive the psychic investigator. Some such mediums were simply psychic frauds, plying their trade, and yet performing a service in their way. For to these humble living rooms, furnished with religious emblems, pictures of Christ and the saints, came the poor and disturbed, the shop girls, poor matrons, wives of icemen and factory workers. These people were aliens to the world of psychology. They never visited the psychologist's study, nor were they ever welcomed in Europe to Freud's couch. The theoretical psychologist wanted nothing to do with this segment of society. Often the very existence of such people seemed to present a sharp slap in the face of democracy and psychology alike. For these were the league of democracies unsatisfied, interested in the results that democracy promised but could not produce wholesale. And for all that, in that time, it was the wholesale production of happiness that gave democracy its lure. The goal is not one that any government can provide. Safety can legitimately be expected from good government, and the free opportunity for the development of individual abilities, the creative use of resources, and the existence of worthy employment. But happiness itself is more elusive and comes from sources that cannot be legislated. Many ladies of all ages and stations earned pittances as mediums, tawdry queens of sorry neighborhoods, offering needed counsel and advice, some of it quite sage, to those who were, because of poverty, lack of education, or personal inadequacies, outcasts from the mainstream of American life. These people embarrassed the religions, government, and psychologists alike. The front face of Protestantism was pragmatic. God help those who help themselves. All negativism was to be routed out. If man had a soul, well, let the spiritualists produce it, and without a lot of teary nonsense. Let the spirits of the dead make good sense and prove their case, not go sulking about in ghostly gowns in Miss Chowder's back parlor. Thursday afternoon, January 27, 1977. Yet it was precisely to such Miss Chowder's back parlors that I was often led, hat hesitantly in hand, skeptical eyes politely lowered, as initially I spied out the lay of the land, for it was difficult to see how miracles of the spirit could emerge from such grubby settings, chipped wainscoting, dirty doorsteps, entire rooms saturated with the intermixed odors of incense, candle wax, boiling onions, potatoes or beef of the poorest persuasion, garlic, cough potions, and other spices or oils of musty but otherwise mysterious properties? Could the recipe for the soul's comfort be mixed in such kitchens? Better to keep on your muffler, wind it about your nose to keep out the noxious odors, sit down and get to business, leaving such questions and mutterings for a more comfortable moment. For our work was more intimately concerned with homey paraphernalia than our scientific documents might show, and also connected in most devious ways with the passing of the seasons. For example, our investigations were twice as complicated in the winter for rather amusing reasons not at first apparent, particularly in Boston, where the dampness had a bone-chilling effect that even the sunny-minded felt most acutely. Ladies, therefore, went about fully decked, even in their households, with layers upon layers of wool and muslins beneath their skirts, to say nothing of the shawls, sweaters, capes and aprons that they wore atop. Winter, then, provided legitimate excuse for bulky underclothing that was often used not so much for warmth as for the concealment of magnets to make tables move, nuts cracked together to make wrappings, and scribbled messages on pieces of paper that later materialized as if freshly written on by the dead, a like piece of blank paper being first, obviously, placed on the table, and later quickly replaced with the concealed one. It took the greatest courage and most delicate coughing, and most gentle yet demanding of glances for an investigator under such circumstances to suggest that the good woman's clothing might be concealing more than ample hips or bosom, and those men brave enough, in certain situations, to request permission to search the lady's underpinnings were accused of having more than scientific interest on their minds. In that chill northwestern climate, however, and in the evening when many seances were held, there was a certain charm, perhaps, who knows, an innocent enough hope that against the deeper winter of the soul, here such homey ingredients might spark those necessary elements of the heart that must, if any do, unite the living and the dead. The scientist well knew that he lacked whatever emotional impetus might be needed, so bemoan the circumstances as he might, he also felt himself to be an outsider, a watcher, seeing what spark the emotions of the others might provide that he could use. Alas, we were often deceived, and yet, as I shall explain later, not deceived but taught deeper lessons than we knew. I was acquainted with the rudiments of hypnosis, as were many of my colleagues, and while we spoke about suggestion from our side, it never really occurred to us that many of these unlettered women were far better hypnotists than we, that they learned techniques more effective, quicker, and often more pleasant than our own, or that indeed they understood better than we the dictates, needs, and yearnings of the human heart. The lessons usually escaped us. I recall how often I fussed and fumed, stomped angrily from a dark front porch out into the waiting carriage, deriding in low but fierce tones the transparent trickeries of some woman I had caught in fraud. I had indeed perceived deceptions, ectoplasm made of cotton, the entire roll once dragged out in the middle of a séance by the family cat. But the sitters who should have been angriest turned their ire on me rather than upon the perpetrator of this deception. Poor ignorant people, I would think, shaking my head, missing an important point entirely. The medium's excellent use of hypnosis was such that even in the face of disclosure, her sitters literally heard her voice only, her arguments, and she had convinced them, all evidence to the contrary, that they had been visited by the dead. In a fashion, this was as much an extraordinary performance as a legitimate visitation of the deceased, for the sitters believed what they saw under the medium's suggestions even when the props were shown to be deceptive. The ghost turned out to be the medium's young sister, parading through the darkened room in slippers, or the plaintive moan, "Mama," proved to be the neighbor's child, hidden behind the drapery. Paid a penny for each "mama" cried on cue. Friday morning, January 28, 1977. One of our errors was in regarding the intellect alone as capable of judgments, and as the final arbitrator of events. Feelings and sentiments can be used, should be used also, for the emotions make their own judgments of reality, and it is against those more volatile opinions that we ultimately assess our acts. That is, the emotions also provide a legitimate though different framework with which to test the results of any event, paranormal or otherwise, and the emotions' truth may respond to an inner objective reality that has its own rules and values that are not mysterious or hidden, but perceivable if you use the proper measuring tool. Such a proposition is most difficult to defend intellectually, yet there are some analogies to be found. A novel can be true in the deepest sense, for example, though the details within it are quite false in scientific terms, if the places and the people mentioned therein do not exist in fact. The scientist, judging such a work by the rules of his own discipline alone, might indeed entirely miss the dimensions of the artistic, creative world, or dismiss such works as beneath serious adult consideration. The fictional events of the novel are symbolic statements about inner emotional realities that have deep validity. There is a definite correspondence between such imaginative events and the objective world. The trouble is, of course, that this correspondence is not measurable in usual terms. To dismiss it for that reason, however, would be to rob the world of its invaluable artistic heritage and accomplishment. While I became, in life, more and more disillusioned with the results of paranormal investigations, therefore, I became in time more and more convinced that the fictionalized events of many seance rooms, those spooky dramas formed of desperate hopes, emotional frenzies, creative fabrications, and subconscious dramatizations, those morality plays in miniature, occurring in neighborhood after neighborhood, stood for inner realities. They symbolized inner facts, if you prefer, even when they were fraudulent, and held the same correspondence to events after death as conventional novels or plays did to daily life. We could compare the works of art to the events they symbolized, but the reality of the afterlife presents us in life with no ready yardstick with which to measure what truths or inner facts reside in the seance or other such psychological events. The seance is, however, a social event in that there are participants, an audience oftentimes, and we are faced by the same problems that witnesses provide whenever they are expected to state clearly the bare facts of their experience. Such are the powers of the creative imagination that such participants may, in fact, that is, physically, perceive the fictionalized events, may actually see the apparition under the suggestion of the medium in a psychological drama in which the medium herself is convinced of the apparition's appearance, because, like the scientists perhaps, she trusts the evidence of her senses, and those senses might indeed show her the shadowy image of a person, the deceased, clearly positioned. She may hear words which she repeats for the sitter, taking it for granted that no fraud exists in such a hypothetical case. What are we to say? We must say that we do not understand perception itself, so I told myself. More on this later. But if we look at the seance as a creative, dramatic, psychological event, we can at least compare it to other more conventional dramas, such as religious or artistic productions and ceremonies. We have, for example, a set of conventions and a loose cast of characters, the Indian guides, doctors, philosophers, poets, and other personae, the denizens of the dead, in other words, who serve as controls or mediators between the medium and the deceased. Perhaps these are artificial productions, fictionalized characters come into life, so to speak, through the medium's gestures, voice, and actions, instead of simply appearing on the printed page as the main characters of a novelist's art. Or perhaps this also represents a kind of creative synthesis with which we are usually unfamiliar, a psychological reorientation that allows the medium to tune in to a different perceptive environment, which is then interpreted in terms that we do understand. Again, so I told myself, I wondered, if the theater productions of the actor's world stand in an objective reality, then what is behind the seance's creative drama? Is the medium's experience a symbolic role-playing, I asked, that tries to depict through personification a definite alteration of consciousness that does, in fact, occur after death? I must profess that those seances I attended in life were far from quality artistic productions, however, and those performances that came under the guise of art, such as automatic writing, gave little evidence of creative merit. I found primitive art charming, but such primitive gropings with the written word embarrassed me to the core. At least, such was my own reaction to those manuscripts that came to my attention. There were also, however, more cultivated ladies, from sheltered environments, who held their seances in the tasteful parlors of the well-to-do, amid rich wall hangings, with maids serving tea and cakes, parlors visited by quite educated men of letters, women whose honesty and sincerity were beyond doubt. Here the setting was more proper, the rapport between medium and investigator far more comfortable. Current news and gossip might be discussed before the curtains were drawn, but in their anxiousness to prove their cases, such ladies often produced only a more stately version of events with which the investigators were already familiar, a more cultivated package, perhaps, but no more content. These more respectable ladies regulated their own emotional tones, perhaps automatically, in response to the investigator's distrust of sentiment, trying to be even more reasonable, more logical, so that the results of their intuitive experiments would be favorably received. This was a pity, for such attempts worked counter to whatever abilities the ladies possessed. Paranormal events, however, had been labeled in such a way, often by psychologists themselves, that the incident of them carried the tinge of unrespectability at best, and at the worst implied the most dangerous kinds of hysteria. Experiments by psychologists in hypnosis deepened these connections by producing, through suggestion acting upon hypnotist and subject alike, those results that were expected. So-called split personalities were psychologically manufactured by such dallyings, tailored to fit the hypnotist's preconceptions. A good hypnotist automatically hypnotizes himself before he begins to work his suggestions upon the mind of another, a fact not in the least understood then or now. Nor did the true scientist dare allow himself to experience paranormal events, generally speaking, for to do so would put him into the same kettle, bringing into question those qualities of objectivity, intellectual discrimination, and emotional balance that he believed separated him from those he studied. The more such a man tried to dismiss his emotions, to retain an objective stance, the more his emotional needs strained at the academic leash, and the more he became fascinated by the emotional elements under investigation, the greater his risk of losing his psychic virginity. Friday afternoon, January 28, 1977. Exploring the frontiers of the mind was more than a metaphor. The optimistic, aggressive, democratic march was to extend not only across the continent, but to the very soul of the country. Unfortunately, the techniques that fostered industry and emerging technologies were not those that best encouraged the research into man's mind. For one thing, the mind was to be harnessed, directed, focused in order to help man in his battle against nature, and against what he saw as the unreasonable, savage impulses of his own nature. At the same time, the highest ideals of democracy were often pursued with brawling indifference to the needs of others, with a disregard for sentiment except when it met national or patriotic needs. Those needs were largely understood in terms of Protestantism, interpreted according to American interests. Godliness meant social works, but in a no-dallying manner, and God helped those who helped themselves. To that end, the psychologist tried to retain a crisp manner, a clear-cut optimism, a scientific stance that all in all stood for no nonsense, except, of course, that perpetuated in psychology's name. In this general atmosphere, it seemed safest to me to concentrate my efforts in theory rather than practice, and to serve as a messenger of sorts between men working in the field, so to speak, and their colleagues in the universities. I also settled upon certain other refinements, dictated certainly by the characteristics of my own temperament. That temperament, while attracted by the hurly-burly, the rambunctiousness of its time, by the democratic spirit in action, was also aristocratic, withdrawn, one might say, queasy at the over-rich diet of democratic comradeship, and also tinged by an almost constant melancholy. For a scientist, I was overly aware of my own states of mind, overly preoccupied with my moods, yet I was too critically attuned, too skeptical of the emotions to give them sway, and so lacked the emotional energy of the artists. No coincidence, then, that I settled upon a critical analysis of states of mind, the intellectual investigation of religious inspirations, the sometimes gloomy pursuit of man's triumphant spirit in death, since in life that triumph eluded me so steadily. Had I tried these two characteristics of mine together, I could have ridden emotion's power into the highest states of creativity, at least to the best of my ability, and at the same time given my intellect a creative freedom, forming a synthesis that I know now should be the natural state of man's psyche, in an understanding of man's creative forces and the tension between intellect and emotions, can be found those thus far elusive clues to the powers of the psyche that do indeed allow it to continue its existence after death, though in an altered state of consciousness, and in an environment that bears the same relationship to physical life as physical life does to the theater production, while combining the most creative elements of each. End chapter 1. I thank you. Hang in there because it gets really, really good. Aloha.